Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well and staying safe these days as always. So I have another motherboard review here for you. This one's from MSI, another Z690 chipset based motherboard. This is the Tomahawk, MAG Tomahawk motherboard. This is actually the DDR4 variant. You can actually see right over there. There is actually a DD5 variant, but this is actually the DDR4. Also has Wi-Fi in it as well too. So why don't we go ahead and pop this motherboard open. You can actually see the box over here. That's wonderful goodness. Let's go ahead and get this open, installed. Do a quick BIOS overview as well too, as always. And just to make sure, I'll probably even toss on Windows 10 and also Windows 11 little clips of that as well too. So let's go ahead. As always, before we go ahead and get this box opened up, let's go ahead and take a look at the back of the box just for some details, generic details back here. And some little things that actually stand out here obviously is the 2.5G LAN, which is becoming much more popular these days with mid-range and upper-range motherboards. Obviously Wi-Fi, Bluetooth over here, some sort of a premium sound card. I'm not particularly the biggest fan of onboard sound cards. I actually on my main system use a dedicated one, but they're actually really good. Have used them a number of times, and even on my secondary PC I use it. So onboard sound cards are actually becoming quite the thing these days, but of course you always do have that option to upgrade to a dedicated sound card as well too. Looks like 4 M2 and NVMe slots, and all of them will be running at that particular speed that you're hoping to see here. And looks like that's about it. A little bit of a picture here of the rear of the motherboard as well too. So let's go ahead and pop this box open over here. Some little thing here to notice immediately, you do see Windows 11 compatible, and of course the TPM 2.0, probably one of the things that really got in the way for people upgrading to Windows 11, of course, if you're not going to be using any little bypass trick. So it looks like on this side, there's a little box here. I'm going to probably, well actually, this actually feels like it's empty. I was actually thinking it was going to be the Wi-Fi antennas, but we'll take a look at that in just a moment. We do have the motherboard here, a little box within the box kind of thing. So let me go ahead and pull this out real quick. We'll take a look at everything else that's actually here first. Looks like we actually do have 2 SATA cables here, and more builds these days obviously relying on the NVMe SSDs. So obviously these are being used much less, particularly since optical drives are not being used much these days either. Looks like we do have a little USB thumb drive here. And this actually is a really great feature that so far MSI, as far as I know, has actually been following. Instead of putting all the drivers on a CD or DVD, they actually put on a little USB thumb drive that you can actually plug in. We have a couple little screws here for the M2 drives. You can actually see that right there. Pretty good label. Looks like another one, which is good because this does have 4 slots. A couple little stickers here. You can actually see that, MAG. Quick installation guide. Looks like it opens up just to give you some quick details on installation and whatnot of your motherboard and CPU. A little shout out thing over here, basically to kind of enter into a little contest you may actually win when you put a little bit of a video review or just another review on their website, I believe. So definitely check that out if you're interested. Another little looks like a little postcard here to join the MSI rewards. I'm actually a member of that, so definitely check that out. I believe you can get probably just a couple little things that are like stuff for Steam to purchase games with. Thank you for choosing MSI. Product was created with great passion and hope you enjoy it. Please register your item, of course. Another little booklet here with just items such as mice, video cards, keyboards, and headsets as well. And here is your manual. This manual is actually pretty thick. I'm guessing it's going to be in different languages. And of course, one of the big reasons we look into this is to actually see where the front panel connections are. This little badge sticker here with the MSI Dragon. So that's basically it for that. Let's go ahead and take a look at the motherboard. This motherboard is actually a Wi-Fi motherboard. I was actually correct. The Wi-Fi antennas, 2 little sticks here, are actually in this particular area here. Before we go ahead and give you an entire view of the entire motherboard here, I actually just gained a good hands-on this particular board. Can absolutely see what a premium motherboard is for a mid-range board, and a very nice build quality so far. The heat sinks look really good, feel good. And the heat sinks covering the M2 slots also looking very solid. There's actually like a little bit of a heat sink you can actually see here and up here. And of course, I'll give you a better look at that cover every M2 slot here. Taking a look, just a real quick skim down here. I'm just going to just make sure this is focusing correctly. We do see the port here for your onboard sound card. If you're actually going to have some front panel connections, such as a headphone and mic jack, you can actually go ahead and plug those right over here. We have a couple of LED connections. You can actually see those two right here. Both of them appear to be 3-pin. So you can actually go ahead and plug in some RGB connections as well. A little bit further to the right, looks like we do have two 4-pin fan connections, two system fan connections. There's definitely more all around the motherboard, and I'll definitely give you a good view of those as well too. Right over here, this is actually becoming much more popular. It looks like a Thunderbolt connection for front panel connections on your case, and obviously this will be really useful considering the amazing speeds, data transfer speeds that Thunderbolt does offer. As mentioned, looks like additional system fan right over here, another 4-pin. As a matter of fact, all of them should actually be 4 pins these days, so I'll probably just stop mentioning the 4-pin detail. Right over here, further to the right, looks like we have two old-fashioned USB 2.0 connections. You can definitely use them for front panel connections, but some devices that you may actually be installing on your computer may actually require these in terms of monitoring. One little example I can give you is Corsair does have a monitoring unit, a little cable that you can actually connect to one of these connections. So you can actually keep an eye on all the voltage and current and all the other little details of your power supply, as well as actually control the fan, the built-in fan in it as well too. A little bit further to the right, we have a couple, looks like 4 SATA port connections over here. And I'm actually looking to see if there's any on the side, and there definitely is. We'll take a look at that in just a moment as well. Right over here, looks like we do have the front panel connections for your case. These are always very interesting and cumbersome to actually plug in. After doing so many motherboard reviews, actually got a pretty good memorization of where all the connections actually go. So if you're like me, you very likely may not have to look at the booklet for that. And additionally, looks like we have another 4-pin fan connection right over here. Just above the little pins here for the front panel is a 4-pin for a PC speaker. If anyone still uses that option is right there. Taking a look at the side as well, right up here. Before I skip them right here, on the right side of the motherboard, we have those two additional SATA ports. A total of 6 SATA ports on this mid-range motherboard here, so just keep that in mind. Bear in mind as well too, if you're going to be using more than one M2 slot for your drives there, 2 of these SSD ports may actually be disabled, so go ahead and take a look at your manual to actually see which SATA ports will actually be disabled if you're using more than one M2 slot. Considering that not many people use SATA ports much anymore, shouldn't be a big deal. Very popular these days. Obviously, it looks like a USB-C front panel connection right over here that are very good to support USB 3.1, 3.2, USB Type-C connections. But if you're going to be using just regular USB 3 right over here, looks like that's a connection here for your front panel as well. To the right here, looks like we do have the old-fashioned 24-pin motherboard connection over here. This is actually a connection that's not really changed. It has changed from 20 to 24 pin, I would say a little over 10 years ago or so, and has not ever changed again. Looks like this will probably just be the generic deal for some time to come. A little bit to the right, looks like just hiding right over here, looks like we do have 4 indicator LED connections. This is actually really useful for trying to see if anything is, if your motherboard's actually having an issue booting up. You can actually see what might be causing the issue here: CPU, memory, GPU, or RAM, I believe. And these little lights will immediately cycle through every time your computer turns on. If you see a red light there for an extended period of time and your computer does not post, very likely there's an issue with that particular device. A little bit further to the right, looks like we do have another 4-pin fan connection. And a little bit more to the right on the top of the motherboard. Go ahead and bring this over here. We have 2 additional RGB LED connections. One of them is a 3-pin, one's a 4-pin, so just something to keep in mind there as well. Additionally, it looks like we have 2 more 4-pin fan connections. This is actually dedicated for your CPU, and this one's dedicated for a pump. If you'll be using water cooling with radiators on there, this would be your ideal connection for that. Technically speaking, you can use any 4-pin fan connection on this board for a fan, for your CPU fan or any other fan, but Usually a good idea to actually use this as a dedicated CPU cooler. In case there's a failure, your motherboard can immediately advise you on that. Going past this really nice solid looking heatsink over here with the MAG logo, we run into two 8-pin CPU power connections. So giving you the ideal connection here for power usage if you're planning to overclock on your CPU in this in your build here. You only actually really need to only connect one of these just for regular use, but if you're going to be overclocking and whatnot, you may actually need the other connection as well. Some motherboards actually have one 8-pin and one 4-pin. This one actually has two double 8-pins, so some options there if you actually need them. And moving along here, very important, we do have the backplate I/O shield and all the connections here. One thing I forgot to mention a little earlier, the motherboard does have the back shield I/O plate built onto the motherboard, which is really ideal. I've actually become to really enjoy these particular builds since you know, that little plate can sometimes be forgotten, lost, or you know, this just actually looks much more ideal here. So taking a look at these connections back here, if your CPU is going to be using an integrated graphics like a GPU on board, you'll be able to use this display port and HDMI connection back here. Right next to that, looks like we have this little flash BIOS button. I believe this does give you the capability to just plug in a USB thumb drive onto a specific port. Looks like this one right here with a later build, and you'll be able to actually update your BIOS here without the need of a CPU and memory as well too, I believe. So completely, basically just power, you can actually update the BIOS, and that's very useful if later in the future Intel releases additional CPUs for this particular chipset, and this motherboard does not support it just yet. So speaking of USB ports, we do have 4 USB ports here. Looks like 2 of them are 2.0, a couple of 3s. To the right, it looks like we have a couple of 3.1s. And to the right of that, another 3.1 and a Type-C USB connections. Looks like a total of about 8 connections. Right above, we have that 2.5G gigabit connection, very useful these days, giving you much faster transfer speeds if your router switch or on the other computer supports it. To the right of that, we have the 2 little connections here for your Wi-Fi antenna, and also this is actually also for Bluetooth as well too. Now I actually do not use Wi-Fi on desktop builds for the most part, so I usually disable it in the BIOS. But you'll have to connect these little antennas if you plan to use Bluetooth, otherwise you only have a range of about a foot or 2, and that's not really going to be ideal for any use. To the right, we do have our audio connections, and just to let you know, there is an optical audio connection right over here. You can actually use that for optical audio cables. And of course, here's your standard red stereo connection here that is usually green, but MSI just likes to make it red. And a little bit further, we do have an additional system fan connection here. Taking a little closer at the slots, we do have one PCI Express slot here. This is actually a X Generation 5 PCI Express slot. This is the ideal connection and location for any GPU you'll be using. All the other slots here are actually Generation 4, but this, again, you'll be using this ideally for your video card. That pretty much also goes for the M2 slot right up here as well too. This would be your ideal slot for using M2 NVMe drives when you install them. Additionally, you do have one over here, I believe, and I believe there should be 2 side by side right over here. Is basically what these numbers go: 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's almost actually easy to miss this particular drive here. I'll probably go ahead and open this up during the build just to actually give you a good view. Up here is our Intel socket 1700. This little plastic cover can just be removed, and obviously since Intel CPUs are pinless, all the pins are actually built on the motherboard, so this little plastic cover is actually here for protection from any of those pins getting bent. One little thing I actually forgot to, looks like I kind of skipped over, are the 4 DIMM slots right over here. Ideally you'll be using this slot here for dual channel, since this motherboard does not actually support quad channel. So you'll be using dual channel for these, ideally for 2 memory chips. You can definitely use 4 memory chips, but they'll both be running in dual channel as well too. Just for the looks and feels, looks like a very premium and solid motherboard. Definitely has quite a bit of a weight to it. I would say about, feels like 4 pounds or so. Weighs more than my Surface Pro 7 with its keyboard attached, that's for sure. So let's go ahead and toss this to a system, get a CPU installed, memory, power supply, video card installed, and get this all built up. Hope everyone enjoyed that quick build process here. Go ahead and shoot that like and subscribe button if you definitely want to go ahead and support the channel. If you really enjoy what you're seeing here, find it really useful and informative, and also be notified when additional videos, review videos, and also unboxings and whatnot come out as well too. Thank you again for your support. So we do have a setup here. The system has already booted up and we got the BIOS that came up. This motherboard did actually behave a little strangely at first. It did appear that it kind of booted up, rebooted itself 2 times or so before eventually coming out to the BIOS. So kind of strange, maybe because it's a brand new board, of course. It probably just does that for some reason. But here we are, and no reboots or anything like that since. So right now we're actually looking at the easy mode of the MSI BIOS here. There's actually 2 modes you can actually see here. On the advanced, if you click on F7 or click here, you'll switch over to the advanced one. But we're going to go ahead and cover both of them, the easy one being first. So immediately you see some of the most basic details here, your CPU speed, your memory speed, temperatures from both the motherboard and CPU, some voltage, VCore, what kind of BIOS version your motherboard is currently booting with, the full name of the motherboard, the CPU, in this case is the 12100F Core i3. 12th generation Intel CPU, total amount of memory 32 gigabytes, the BIOS version, and of course the BIOS build date, which dates to about mid-range from December of 2021, so I'm pretty sure there's definitely an update. And I'll go ahead and update the BIOS in a little while as well too. Immediately below you do see basically some boot priority options here. This is basically, you can actually go ahead and move these around if you want to go ahead and change the order of boot for the devices that are currently available. Obviously we do have a network here, USB, and of course the main hard drive here. I actually currently only have one SSD plugged into this particular drive, and I'll get into that. It's actually a SATA one. I'll get into that very shortly here as well. To the left, you actually do see some game boost options. You do see the little options here for the XMP profiles built into the memory. Go ahead and select one or the other if you choose to do so. Here you can actually go ahead and activate this one, or just deactivate it by re-clicking on it as well too. Just below you do have some option buttons here that once you click on each one on the right, you will actually see the full details of that particular option you clicked on. For example, CPU. You do see the full details here of the particular CPU you do have installed. Obviously details like hyper-threading technology, and of course the frequency at this time. Once I click on memory, you'll see the full memory current frequency for this particular memory. I'm actually going to move it up to 3000, but right now by default usually DDR4 chips begin at 2133. The full speed and which DIMM slots are currently being used here. I'm actually put them into the DIMM slots that are very ideal for dual channel. Just let you know, if you actually did put the memory chips in the wrong slots, even though obviously they're just memory slots, but ideally not ideal for dual channel, at boot up, the motherboard will actually notify you about that. There is a way to actually turn that off if that's something you are willfully doing, but just in case you made a mistake, it will actually warn you about that. Below here, I'll actually also let you know about the XMP profiles. It does have a profile here for DDR4 3000 megahertz, so I can go ahead and activate this and make sure it's actually running at the proper speed. Again, just by clicking this little button if you'd like. Click on the button again for storage. You get some little information here for all the storage devices currently plugged in. As you can see here, one SATA port is currently being used by that Intel 180 gigabyte SSD. Fan speed, some of the little options here for thresholds between the fan speed and temperature. Some options you have here, you can actually click on these little numbers to actually see the current fan speed and RPM for each fan at this time. I really only have 2 system fans connected here, so you'll probably only see 2 of them with a valid RPM. Of course, that doesn't include the CPU fan, which is completely separate. You can see that there. Also associated with it, the CPU core temperature. Obviously, the higher this gets, the higher the fan speed will get. You can also increase or decrease and change those thresholds. And an option here as well as here too. P is actually for pump if you're using a CPU cooler with water cooling and a radiator connected. In this case, I'm not, so obviously this fan is not connected. As I mentioned before though, you can actually alternate which connections all these fans will be used here. So if you're actually not using a pump fan connection, but you do plug in a 4-pin fan connection here, you'll be able to manipulate it over here, even if it's not related to a fan for a water cooling system. You do ideally want to have the CPU fan connected to the appropriate fan connection here, because if it's not connected, the motherboard may actually complain to you that there's actually a CPU fan failure, which in this case there's not, but according to the motherboard, there likely is. Clicking on the last button, Help, we do have a bunch of hotkeys here to actually go ahead and engage particular systems here, or of course just to save and switch back to default settings and whatnot over here as listed in this area. Below that, looks like we have a couple of buttons here. M-Flash, if you want to engage M-Flash to go ahead and update the BIOS, we'll go ahead and proceed with that particular option in a little while. Favorites, if we click here, we can actually go ahead and set up some hotkey favorites if you'd like to choose to do so. And one of my favorite options for MSI motherboards is the hardware monitor. Once you click here, you have a much more optional way to actually go ahead and change those CPU temperature thresholds and be able to manipulate them quite easier just by moving this little dot up and down if you manually want to go ahead and change that. Click on each button here for each associated fan. In this case, system fan 4 and 6 are actually my two system fans here. Go ahead and see here, this one is currently running at 687. If I go ahead and increase the voltage here, the RPM will slowly begin to increase. If you go ahead and increase the voltage here and just bring it up a little bit, you'll immediately notice that the fan speed begins to increase. In this case, I actually just go ahead and increase the system fan number 4. Go ahead and increase number 6 as well too. On the bottom here, you do have the option to go ahead and activate or deactivate certain options. You can actually go ahead and turn off the onboard audio controller in this case, and some other options here as well. Here, of course, is easy LED control. If you want to go ahead and turn off the control for the onboard LED connections for those basically those nice little colors and lights you want to put inside your case. Here's that CPU fan fail warning control that I actually just mentioned earlier. If you activate this and the CPU fan begins to hit like a 0 RPM or some other issue, this thing will immediately turn off. I'm not sure if it'll give you an audio warning or maybe some message will pop up in Windows. Very good thought right there. But I'm pretty sure it'll definitely give you an audio warning if there's something wrong. And that's pretty much it for the easy mode here. Pretty quick walkthrough because obviously these are all the details you probably need just for a basic boot up and to get up and running into your operating system. Go ahead and click on F7 or just hit the X7 key to switch over to advanced, and immediately here you see a couple of more buttons that look very familiar. All the same options and display on the top actually appear to be the same, including the boot priority, all the CPU and motherboard information, these three buttons here for XMP, CPU, DDR memory, showing up right here along with the time and the date. But we do have more options once we click on each little button here. For example, you go ahead and click on settings, you'll see a couple of little sub options here. System status looks pretty self-explanatory, just a couple of little details of everything currently connected to this board. Clicking on advanced, you do have some options here to control basically a bunch of systems here. For example, integrated peripherals, you can go ahead and activate and deactivate other devices here, such as the Wi-Fi device, the onboard audio controller, and also change SATA hot plug options here as well too. So definitely a lot more options here. Just to go a little bit of a walkthrough here, we do have here a PCI Express, PCI subsystem settings, ACPI settings, Intel Thunderbolt, very important since we do have that onboard Intel Thunderbolt connection if you're going to be using that. USB configuration, if you want to actually be changing this to legacy mode or other options as well. Power management setup, some options here as well too for you. BIOS CSM UEFI mode, definitely keep that in mind. Obviously, if you're using an older video card, this option may not work correctly in CSM, so something to keep in mind because I've definitely run into that myself. Wake up event setup. Secure erase, if you actually want to go ahead and get some options here to go ahead and wipe out your SSD securely. Usually it doesn't take too long. I've actually used a pretty decent little piece of software to actually go ahead and wipe out SSDs, and it actually takes anywhere between 30 seconds to even 5 minutes, depending how large the drive is. This isn't like the old days of using Blanco or DBAN to wipe out mechanical hard drives. And another little option here that they added pretty recently over the last few years, NVMe SSD self-test. You can actually go ahead and do some error checking and self-tests on your M2 drives, NVMe drives, if they're installed. In this case, we actually do not have one installed, so only the Intel 180 gigabyte shows up here, but currently not supported, absolutely for sure. Going back to settings, we do have now the boot option where we can actually go ahead and manipulate the boot priorities Down here, go ahead and change their order. You do have the option to turn on some other options here as well too. Very particular to actually see here the number lock button right here. There you go. You want that on or off on your keyboard all the time when you turn this computer on. And some much more options. Very similar to this boot priority up here. If you do notice, if I actually disable some here, you start to see some empty squares appear in that boot priority little section over here. Security, looks like some options here. If you want to actually put a password, an administrator password on the BIOS, so whenever someone comes into the BIOS, they will not be able to make changes and save them if they do not enter the password. So a lot of options may actually be locked out. Trusted computing, very important for Windows 11 if you really need to mess around with the TPM settings here. Chassis intrusion configuration, if you do have that little sensor on your board, or you have a sensor you want to connect to your board, if obviously it's been triggered, it will let you know that the computer's been opened up. Many manufacturers like Dell and Lenovo like to have that installed on their computer systems. Secure boot, some options here for that as well too. And of course, last here is a save and exit button. You can go here to just go ahead and leave and save all the changes you've made and reboot the system. Moving on to OC, we do have a bunch of options here for overclocking and just basically making some manual changes to your motherboard. One little change I'm actually going to do here is actually increase the memory. Adjusted DRAM frequency, I can go ahead and just click here. Right now it's set to auto, and I can go ahead and just click on 3000. Immediately right up here actually does tell you just made that change. That's actually something new, very interesting. Moving along here, there's a bunch of other options. Obviously, just be really careful to be messing around with a lot of settings here. If you're actually not familiar with what to do, you could absolutely damage your CPU or motherboard by triggering a wrong voltage or a wrong memory timing here as well too. So definitely know what you're doing here before making any changes. Some very serious voltage and timing settings here for the CPU and memory as well. I did also notice on top here, there's this little OC Explorer mode. You can actually go ahead and change it to normal, which looks like it removes a number of settings that usually does not really cater to people who are just curious about overclocking and maybe just want to make one or two little changes, as opposed to somebody who actually wants to make changes such as voltage or timings. Just below, we also do have the M flash button again, which will take you to the section to go ahead and update the BIOS. Moving on to the right side here of the button, we do have this little OC profile button here if you want to go ahead and save some overclocking profiles once you actually made some changes to the BIOS, which may cater to a particular testing setup for overclocking. You can actually go ahead and save those and basically just have multiple ones as well too if you're actually really curious about using one or another every now and then, depending on the situation that you'll be using that particular overclocking setting for. You also do have the option to actually save those to USB or even restore them from USB as well. Hardware modder, we do have that button here again as well too, which I basically mentioned before. Same little section here, looks exactly the same. You can actually go ahead and manipulate all the fan and temperature thresholds here. And down here, it looks like give it a try beta run. This is actually a very new button over here that I've not noticed in previous motherboards, MSI motherboards. And it looks like some options here that have actually just been recently introduced, such as this. Like I said, this is something I haven't really seen before. And it looks like these settings are actually just not necessarily beta, but just brand new. They may or may not keep it. Maybe it is actually beta. They may actually remove it. So it looks like those settings here are there for you to actually give a shot. Very interesting little button up here that I did notice. If you actually want to take a screenshot of what you're looking at right now and you have a USB thumb drive plugged in, you can actually click on the F12 key, where you actually be able to save a screenshot of it is actually what you're looking for. Now, obviously with smartphones these days, someone can just take a picture of this with their phone and still get a somewhat quality picture from it. But if you actually want to be very professional, you can actually do a screenshot here and save it on the thumb drive. I actually have not done that myself, but I may actually go ahead and plug in the thumb drive in a moment and see how that picture comes out. So I did go ahead and plug in a USB thumb drive with the latest firmware. As a matter of fact, that firmware is dated from March 23rd, so very, very recent. It does go ahead and bring all the updates since this particular build date right over here from December 17th of last year. And it also did mention that it's going to be supporting upcoming new Intel CPU. So very interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and update this particular BIOS with that firmware right now. Just out of curiosity, I did mention the F12 key. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. It looks like it does see my thumb drive plugged in, so I'm just going to go ahead and save it there. Looks like a little snapshot was saved, so I'll go ahead and take a look at that very shortly. To go ahead and update the BIOS, let's go ahead and click on the M Flash button. It's going to say, do you want to reboot? And we'll go ahead and click on yes. It's going to immediately turn off and turn right back on to go into flash mode. Now bear in mind with MSI motherboards, I've actually noticed this little goof that may or may not have already been addressed. If you actually go into this particular mode by accident, and you're like, oh, okay, no problem, I'll just go ahead and reboot my computer again. Sometimes I've noticed occasionally that the BIOS settings that your motherboard had just before you went and entered into flash mode have been reset. So you may have to actually go ahead and reconfigure all those setups again. It shouldn't take long, but if you did have any customization going on in there, just bear in mind they've just been reverted back to default. All right, so here we are. Here's my thumb drive. I'm going to go ahead and click on this. This is actually what I'm actually looking for. Click on enter here. And it's asking me, do you want to go ahead and select this? It actually looks like the build date is from the 21st of March, maybe a little day or two off. I'm going to go ahead and click on yes. And here we are. The BIOS is immediately updated now. So this is probably going to take anywhere between 2 to 5 minutes. So let's go ahead and skip this moment here. Alright, that actually really didn't take long at all. I don't think even it hit 2 minutes. My previous experience with MSI motherboard BIOS updates usually took anywhere between 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes even a little bit more. This actually skimmed right through the first 50% in literally 20, 30 seconds, which is actually really impressive. Immediately I just went to enter to the BIOS, and now this looks like to be popping up. Go ahead and select your CPU cooler type. Box cooler, tower air cooler, water cooler. Very interesting. Box cooler, obviously what I'm using right now. Tower cooler, maybe very similar to the Be Quiet cooler. Dark Rock cooler number 4, I believe, that I did a review on years ago. This is part of what they're referring to here. And of course, your water coolers here as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on box cooler and click on yes, and here we are. Everything looks like it's pretty much the same for the most part. We do obviously see the BIOS build date is now March 21st of this year, so literally only about 2 or 3 days old. Very impressive. And just click around here, see if I see any immediate differences. Obviously, I'm going to go here. This hasn't really changed, so I'm guessing there's not really too much of a difference other than the fact that it will be supporting some newer CPUs. And definitely the flash, it did actually mention as well too in the notepad that it did improve the flash process as well too as an update prior to this particular build date that I just installed. So I'm guessing that was inherited as well too, and I definitely do welcome that change on other MSI motherboards. I have noticed as again, flashes have actually taken 5-6 minutes even on some MSI boards. Obviously, if you're going from one really old version to a really new one, I can definitely see that happening. But here we are. Went off without a hitch. If you do actually get your hands on a new MSI or any other brand motherboard, And I actually do encourage you to update the BIOS if you actually do see a benefit, just because you don't want to be doing that many years from now when you're scratching your head like, wow, my warranty expired, and now if my motherboard goes dead because of an update, I can't do anything. If you actually update it very early on, you'll be able to return it, exchange it for another motherboard if for any reason something fails. So I did go ahead and install Windows 10 on this computer here with the board and the CPU. And obviously running pretty well. I did go ahead and install some drivers, got the Wi-Fi up and running. And downloads are actually really good speeds as well too. Let's go ahead and bring up some basic information here. You can immediately see 12th generation CPU and 32 gigs of RAM running at 3000 megahertz. And additionally, here of course again this is a CPU with all its cool gloriness, and was actually running at about 4 gigahertz just a moment ago there. So let me just go ahead and see if I can trigger some speeds there. Yeah, you can actually see the speeds jumping up and down and really varying a lot depending on usage for sure. Microsoft Edge has updated itself, so a bunch of other updates still processing. So definitely running pretty well, pretty solid on Windows 10. I did actually receive a couple little comments while doing some previous reviews of Z690 motherboards, and just asking how Windows 10 is running on it. So just go ahead and just give you a little bit of a small overview over here. Everything seems to be running pretty well. Of course, for those of you who are interested in Windows 11, let's go ahead and toss Windows 11 on this particular PC and see how that looks as well too. By the way, just as a little personal note here, this wallpaper, I've always enjoyed it. Newer versions or newer builds of Windows 10 seems to have removed it completely, which is actually just really annoying. Even in the former workplace of mine, I've had to actually download the wallpaper to actually get it to actually show here, because you don't see it anymore, you just see this one. And while this wallpaper is pretty nice, seriously, if you actually had something working for you at one point, don't get rid of it. Unless, of course, you just had some ugly symbols or the wallpaper just looked horrible. I mean, even that Windows XP wallpaper is still famous when someone figured out where the location is actually in the world. Whether you're installing from scratch or updating to Windows 11, either process should really go off without a hitch. And you can see here, Windows 11 is up and running. Let's go ahead and just bring up the system properties over here. You can actually see the full desktop name, the full CPU, the memory and whatnot, everything else that goes along with it. Go ahead and bring up Task Manager. I keep forgetting just out of habit. Every time I always like to right click on the taskbar on the bottom to bring up the Task Manager. This is a little thing about Windows 11 I have no idea why they took out, but you know, it is what it is for the time being. Click on Performance, you can see all the cores in all its glory. And of course, other little details here as well. See the speed is dropping below 1 gigahertz. Unless I go ahead and open up some process, you'll see this basically jumping up. Go ahead and bring that up there again. Yep, there you go. So definitely working without a hitch in Windows 11. Performance in 10 and 11 is pretty much on par with each other. Obviously, each of them have their ups and downs, so it's up to you which operating system you will choose to use. A little close-up of the system itself. I actually do not see any built-in LEDs on this particular motherboard. The only LED light you actually see is coming from those G-Skill memory chips right there. Pretty quiet system. I'm going to try to move the microphone as close as I can. I actually do not really hear any fan speed at all, and mind you, this case is completely open. You actually see me putting my hand inside the computer. And the video card fans are actually off because right now they're passive. And system fans are pretty quiet, CPU fan pretty quiet as well too. I'm pretty sure if that CPU begins to hit like close to the 4 gigahertz speed, I'm sure that thing will start getting a little louder. But for the most part, pretty quiet. There are actually no system fans on the motherboard itself. Everything is pretty much passive as well too. So overall, very good, very solid motherboard MSI has presented here for the Z690 chipset, geared for 12th generation Intel CPUs. Anyway, hope everyone really enjoyed that unboxing, review, installation, and of course the BIOS overview and whatnot. A little bit of a touch in Windows 10, Windows 11, just to be sure that obviously the motherboard and CPU combo does work in both operating systems. Go ahead and shoot a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And of course, go ahead and click on that bell to be notified when new review videos, unboxing videos, and other videos for hardware related stuff comes up. I definitely appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching, everyone. As always, stay safe. Take care.